Our paper reviewers today are Zoe Williams, author and Guardian columnist, and Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator. That's all very, very interesting. What I'd really like is a touch of magic in this morning's programme. So we're going to start, I think, however, with Zoe Williams and the Blairites on the attack in the Sunday Times.
So we'll start, so basically Jim Murphy is furious with Len McCluskey, who yesterday was furious with Jim Murphy. Technically, Jim Murphy had a vote of confidence from the party, right? So he's technically correct when he says his resignation was forced by Len McCluskey.
Len McCluskey, the boss of Unite.
Boss of Unite.
Who
so,
Jim Murphy said would back the loser in a one-horse race, which is a good line
from the guy who 2 weeks ago couldn't pronounce fundamentally. The point is, the Labour Party are really falling back into this really old channel, you know, of kind of, is it the unions or is it the Blairites? And
the rest of the country doesn't very much.
You know, the fact is the Telegraph described Jim Murphy as a respected, well-liked Blairite. Now, he may well be respected and well-liked. Nobody voted for him. So it doesn't matter what the party thinks of him. It doesn't matter what the English media thinks of him. If he can't get any votes, then he's not respected and he's not well-liked.
Fraser, you've got Andy Burnham's interview in The Observer this
Yes,
morning.
if unions don't like Jim Murphy, they do like Andy Burnham, who is now the front runner in the race. And during this interview, he's doing his best to position himself as a centrist. He's tacking, to, I suppose you could call it, to the right on the areas that the unions don't much care about. For example, mansion tax. He says he's not a fan of that. He doesn't mind being rude about Labour's historic record of spending. He doesn't mind dropping language about predators versus producers. But on the things the unions do care about, health reform, they don't want it. Free schools, they don't want them. He is bang in line with the unions on those issues. So he's trying to balance it that way, being with the unions on things they care about and talking like a Blairite on things the unions don't.
So he's trying to attract support from all over. We'll probe that with him shortly.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's a very old school strategy, right? We're still dealing with kind of Brown versus Blair battles. And that's Cruddis's point in The Observer.
Which we have, I think,
which we have here.
John Cruddis, he was one of the kind of slightly blue Labour people.
Yeah, well, he was kind of blue-red. Anyway, he's a really interesting thinker, Cruddis.
He's a thinker.
He is a really interesting thinker. And part of the problem with the way he was kind of manoeuvred in kind of Miliband's lot was that he, 1 minute would be incredibly influential and the next minute would be really piped down. So there was kind of, he was amplified and then reduced
We didn't hear much of him during the Miliband years. He wasn't...
Well, he wrote a lot of the actual key material.
He was
thinking, you know. But a lot of us saw him thinking in action. Anyway,
but the fundamental thing is...
I think the best line is that, you know, they decided on a 1-0 win. They decided they could take a 35% win and keep the offer really small so as not to alienate anybody. And it was completely wrong because it ended up with no big vision.
Liz Kendall said yesterday that she thought that unless the Labour Party got this right, they could never, ever be in power again. They might be out of power forever. Forever's a big word.
Do you feel like they're slightly vying with one another to see who can be the most catastrophic? It's like whoever says things are the worst is the biggest.
But you can see why they're concerned. Unless Labour can break free from unions, which is where the money is, then they'll never make that broader appeal that John Cruddis wants to talk about.
I really disagree with that, actually. I think the problem with the broader appeal is that we always conceive it as a kind of aspiration. They have to appeal to the aspirational classes. And aspiration in that context really means acquisition. It's like people who want stuff. But actually, I think a lot of people do aspire to a better society. And if they could make an offer in which they promised that things would be better rather than just, we'll protect you slightly more from those big bad capitalists over there, then I think they could actually break through. But that will require them having a conversation much, much larger than unions versus modernisers, which is like, you know, half the people voting today weren't even alive when that conversation was relevant.
Meanwhile, we were all wondering about Chaka Amuna, why he was clearly on the edge of announcing last weekend on the sofa. Peter Mandelson was not quite laying on hands, but was quite close to doing so. Then he did announce, rather cleverly, with a kind of an online video, and then he suddenly pulled back out again. Every paper has tried to find out why.
Well, they have. When he, stood down only a few days after putting himself forward, people imagined a great scandal was about to unfold.
Pick up the Sunday papers and you'll find the truth.
Yes, and I think the Sunday papers have been doing their best to find the real Jugga story, and there have been some sort of hilarious results. I mean, nobody seems to have anything on him. And my favourite is the Mail on Sunday, though. They've exposed the fact that he goes to these swanky bars. One in particular, and this one is, it's got eelskin walls, it's got brandy bottles in display cases, And it's a sort of, you know, I don't know. I suppose you could say who can afford 300 quid for a bottle of brandy. But then again, the fact that Chucker's quite suave and quite likes the high life. He's got a pad in Corfu. He likes his tailor-made suits.
Eelskin lined bar is the absolute deadly.
Well, how could Labour elect somebody who goes to a bar
with eelskin form?
I know, there will be people campaigning on behalf of the eels right now as we speak.
Okay. Now, Nigel Farage is in the papers in a big way, Zoe.
Yes.
And the good news for everybody who enjoys entertainment in politics is that he plans to be around until 2035.
I know.
Unless that's a joke, which he may well be, of course.
He's really thinking big, isn't he? The weird thing about Farage now is that he's got to a point where he's on a knife edge between being himself and being a parody of himself. And you can quite well imagine him turning around tomorrow and saying, well, I was joking, you idiots. Of course I was joking. I won't be alive in 20 years. Anyway, his vow is to be the boss for the next 20 years. It's a very kind of pugnacious, boozy interview. My favourite quote in it is, there are two types of people that drink water, alcoholics and Puritans. I mean, I kind of, you know, water is a drink of choice. I kind of agree with him. But it's quite a strange way to really kind of nail your... It's not exactly the diet of worms, is it?
But the more important point he's making here is that UKIP may have 4 million votes, but it's still Nigel's party. It's still a one-man organisation. Yeah. And people like Douglas Carswell and Patrick O'Flynn had thought, right, it's time to move on. In other words, get rid of Nigel. And because they actually fear that he will screw up the EU referendum, that if he is the face of out, then Britain will vote in. So the Eurosceptics actually want him gone because they think he's now a liability. But
he's a Marmite politician.
Is that serious, though? I mean, could he be a liability in the in-out situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Because his strategy is very polarising. He is liked and loathed in vastly unequal measure. And this is fine if you want to win 14% of the vote. But if you want to win a referendum, a majority, you need a figure who is far more liked more broadly. Now, for everybody thinks, you know, a lot of people think he's great, but far more people think he's dreadful. And if he is leading the out campaign, that is a problem for those who want to go out.
And do you think Carswell would be able to mobilise that kind of mass? I mean, I don't think...
Well, no, Carswell wants politicians out of the EU referendum. He thinks that nobody, Farage...
business people and
or people who are likely to have a better connection with the public. This is the great... The thing is, it's not about personality. The split in UKIP is a real split of policies. Is this party dedicated to getting Britain out of the EU, in which case be quiet during the referendum, or is it the new party of the working class and supplanting Labour, in which case Farage is your man?
And the suggestions that Nigel Farage wants it to be a kind of American Tea Party revolt from the right, and that people like Patrick O'Flynn, their MEP, hate that idea.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, and you can see why. I mean, that would relegate them really to a kind of subterranean
Suzanne
politics
Evans is
forever.
going to explain all of this for us later on, I'm sure. Let's move on, Fraser, to the Nicky Morgan story.
Yeah, well, it's funny, only 2 weeks ago, the consensus was that Nick Clegg would be the Education Secretary by now, that David Cameron would have another coalition, and the Lib Dems would be unwinding all of his school reforms. Well, didn't work out that way. Nicky Morgan's back. All these things written in the Tory manifesto, I suspect written as a negotiating document to be her way. She's now in a position to deliver all of them, and she's spelling out what that means. Full steam ahead. Now, she herself has got to allay concerns that she is not there to stop the Gove revolution, but simply the new face of it. So she says, yes, there will be 500 more free schools, there will be radically more academies, continuing the Blair project, actually.
So you've got a story about Tory local authorities now not terribly happy about what's ahead.
Well, the local authorities have had a terrible time for the past 5 years. 40% of government cuts, 40% of their budgets were cut, and not equitably either.
Can we show the dog the rabbit?
Sorry, of course we can. Here it is. It's a letter. So it's a letter from David Sparks from the LGA. And everybody calls it a Conservative local government organisation, but actually loads of local governments are kind of, you know, it is an umbrella and not a partisan organisation, really. Up to a point. Anyway, they say all the cuts they could make have already been made. So they've already...
They're in for a shock when George Osborne's budget is...
But they're in for... They've already had to make hideous decisions about adult social care, about children's social care, about mental health, about kind of provision for people who really are now who really do need a lot. They've already had to make these. And the awful thing is that everybody blames the council. You know, there is no kind of broad political understanding that these cuts are handed down from the government and it's not the local authorities' fault.
Hence George Osborne's
and the
devolution.
councillors.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah, exactly. Now then, another great figure in British politics, much mocked from time to time, but very important in the first term of the coalition government, is Steve Hilton, who was described by the Sunday Times there as David Cameron's brain, which I thought was extremely rude to both of them.
Well, actually, there was a time where David Cameron's speeches were basically written by Steve Hilton, that his radicalism, especially in the early stage, was all from Steve Hilton's first book called Good Business. Now he's written a new book from California, which he's here in Britain promoting this week. And he gives his little manifesto of Tory radicalism, that he thinks that power should be transferred from government to the people, and democracy is in crisis because no matter who you vote for, the government always gets in. The same people making the same kind of decisions. And he's got not much confidence in politicians' ability to steer the system in a different direction.
It's big government like big business is the problem. It's an inhumane level of organisation. It needs to be broken down. And he is now in favour of independence as MPs. He doesn't want people to vote for parties at all.
And he wants everybody to stand just as themselves, and if they can't cope with a kind of MP role, then they should stand in local government. I mean, I know nobody agrees with me, but I think this could have been written by any left-wing thinker. You know, the targets are exactly the same: entrenched privilege, corrupt corporate influences, vested interests. I mean, any of us could have written this, and actually in my book, I say very much the same thing at the end, which is, you know, you have to take
Zoe
control,
Williams,
everybody.
who has a new book out. I should have said that. Zoe Williams, very interesting new book.
No, I would never have raised it if it hadn't been relevant.
Too late, Jan. Phrase, we have to have something that's not politics in this paper review. And the obvious story, I think, probably is that Prince Harry has given a remarkably outspoken and very interesting interview to the press.
Yes, it's funny. His dad's been in trouble for interfering with politics, but now Prince Harry has got his own policy recommendation for David Cameron: bring back national service. He says that, to quote, "I dread to think where I would be without the army." Now, basically implying his own life would have gone dangerously up. He'd end up like Chuck at Amuna in these nightclubs were it not for the army steering him.
Just in some other country's national uniform, just not his own. I mean, it really, come on.
Yeah. No, but he's making the point that the army turns people's lives around. And I think he was half joking, I don't know, when he says it should be compulsory. But he was saying that when he was commanding 11 men, a lot of those guys would have been in a very different place if it weren't for the military. And I think the point he makes is a very good one. The military is a great tool of social mobility. And the fewer people are brought into the military, the less powerful tool it's going to be.
Yes, very, very interesting interview. Thank you both very much indeed. And next week, by the way, we have Steve Hilton on the sofa reviewing the paper, so he can respond to some of the things we've been saying. Now to the weather. We've had some fine spring sunshine over the past couple of days, but the question, of course, is, will it last? Over to Stan Denaeus in the weather studio. Stav.
Hi there, Andrew.